Hey guys, welcome back. I'm Nina, and I have another somewhat obscure subject to discuss with you. So the question is, did Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, really speak English? And why is that even important? Political leaders typically use highly skilled interpreters for their international meetings and conferences anyway. So first, interpreters aside, knowing an additional language allows political leaders to communicate directly with their counterparts. Such communication may improve the understanding between the two parties about specific political questions if they know the language well enough, or they may simply build a rapport between them. So, for example, the Paris Peace Conference took place between 1919 and 1920, and it officially concluded the First World War and generated the post-war agreement, the Treaty of Versailles. So Germany was the designated vanquished party responsible for the so-called war guilt clause, and the victors were Britain, France, Italy, and the United States, the Big Four. And they were the ones defining the terms of the treaty. Their leaders at the time were Lloyd George, Clemenceau, Orlando, and Wilson. During the conference, Orlando could not communicate with Woodrow Wilson because his second language was French and Wilson only spoke English. So the famous British economist John Maynard Keynes, who was actually one of the financial advisors for the British government at the Paris Peace Conference until his resignation, he was unhappy with the terms. He commented that language was, quote, of historical importance, end quote. He pointed out that Orlando could not communicate directly with Wilson, and that affected his negotiating position, the strength thereof. So Italy was promised through the secret Treaty of London of 1915 additional lands that were to become Yugoslavia. So this was Dalmatia, certain islands on the Adriatic coast, port towns, and so on and so forth. So at the Paris Peace Conference, both Britain and France were kind of reluctant to acknowledge their promises, but they were going to do so. But Wilson was unhappy with that promise through the secret treaty, and he argued in favor of self-determination of Yugoslavia. So we may infer from Keynes's comments that the situation may have played out differently had Orlando been able to communicate with Woodrow Wilson directly. And of course, as a side note, Woodrow Wilson's self-determination applied to Europe, but many places in the Middle East, for instance, Syria, Palestine, in his opinion, had to be under the UN mandate of Britain and France. So there were definite limits to that particular concept. Now let's go back to Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. And for a time, he was probably the most powerful man in the world, ruling the largest country in the world. He was the Secretary General of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union between 1922 and 1953, the year that he died. Everyone knows that Stalin translates as Man of Steel, and his actual real last name was Jugashvili, which is a Georgian last name. His rule domestically was quite authoritarian, but what interests us here is not the domestic situation, but foreign policy, especially in the context of the Second World War, because this is where he would have been communicating or listening to foreign languages, primarily English. So Stalin, Winston Churchill, and Franklin D. Roosevelt comprised the Grand Alliance against Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II. Now, of course, Roosevelt passed away in April of 1945, and his vice president, Harry Truman, replaced him as president and, in fact, completed the war effort for him in Europe in May 1945 and in the Asia-Pacific Theater in August 1945. So periodically, the three leaders met at war conferences to discuss the overarching war strategy, for example, launching the Second Front in continental Europe because it was the Red Army bearing the bulk of the onslaught, the Eastern Front, which ultimately made it responsible for up to 80% of Nazi German losses, and of course the post-war order after 1945 was another subject of discussion for the Big Three. The conferences that Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt, and then Truman attended were Tehran in 1943, Yalta, and Potsdam in 1945. Now, in addition, of course, they met separately. So, for example, Roosevelt and Churchill met at the Casablanca Conference in 1943, and Churchill visited Moscow on a number of occasions to communicate with Stalin directly in 1942, 1944. Obviously, Roosevelt and Churchill spoke the same language, and in fact, at some points, Stalin was concerned that the Anglo-Americans would gang up on him from his perspective, and so Roosevelt was kind of the diplomat, whereas Churchill was more hawkish at these conferences. So, back to the question, how many languages did Stalin actually speak? Well, the question is a little bit harder to answer than it seems. Stalin was born in Gori, Georgia, in the Caucasus, to an impoverished family, and he completed the Gori Orthodox Church School. He went there between 1889 and 1894. Stalin, then known as Jugashvili, he spoke Georgian as his first language, and he became fluent in Russian. As he graduated from that church school, he earned the highest possible grades in Russian, Old Church Slavonic, this was a church school after all, and a very good grade in ancient Greek. Now, there are also claims that Stalin understood conversational Armenian, Azerbaijani, Ossetian, Abkhaz languages, as well as the Mingrelian dialect of the Georgian language. Now, if that was true, it would not be surprising because he then moved to Tbilisi, then known as Tiflis, Georgia, the capital, and it was quite a multicultural city with Armenians and Azeris and Greeks and multiple Georgian ethnicities living there, so he would have encountered that in his daily life. In fact, there are some later testaments to the fact that he did understand these languages and dialects. So, for example, there was an incident where he was riding the train actually to the Tehran conference in 1943, and he was sitting in the same car with his translator for English, and his chief of state security, Lavrentiy Beria, and Beria just started speaking to him in the Mingrelian dialect of Georgian because he was Mingrelian. And Stalin asked him to switch back to Russian because his translator did not understand it. That would have been very rude. So Moving on, Stalin did not complete the Tbilisi or the Tiflis spiritual seminary, but he did attend it between 1894 and 1899. He did well at first, but eventually he got interested in revolutionary ideas and politics. So at this time, he independently attempted to learn French, but we don't really know how far he's gotten in that pursuit because there's not a lot of information about it subsequently. So probably it's accurate to assume that it wasn't too far. After that, he went into exile eventually in 1913. We know he moved to Vienna, Austria, and he probably learned some German conversationally to be able to get around. In fact, in the 1926 census for all of the Soviet Union, he pointed out that he had the reading knowledge of both German and English, but he did not speak those languages. So there was some knowledge, but it was limited. Now in foreign affairs, Stalin preferred interpreters who not only knew foreign languages very well, but also understood foreign policy questions. So for this reason, the Soviet leader relied on professionals like Vladimir Pavlov. Pavlov's focus was English, and he also worked for the People's Commissariat for Foreign Affairs between 1941 and 1947. In fact, he was an assistant to the foreign minister Vyacheslav Molotov. When Stalin first heard Pavlov interpreting live at English at an exam, he was so impressed that he embraced the guy, which sounds very odd in today's context, but you have to understand that back in the day, interpreters of that skill level were really few and far in between. And of course, the Soviet Union was a new political entity on the map. So throughout Pavlov's tenure as the interpreter for the foreign ministry, for Stalin specifically, Stalin treated him like a father, whereas Molotov was very, very cold. And this information comes from interviews given by Pavlov's wife. So needless to say, being the main English language interpreter during a world war and also working for Stalin was a stressful job for this interpreter. In fact, in 1945, Britain awarded Pavlov the Order of the British Empire to sort of acknowledge his input into the war effort and to the shared victory over Nazi Germany. Immediately after the war, Pavlov went on to become an advisor at the Soviet embassy in London. So he had a long career. Now, there's also some evidence that Stalin could actually understand spoken English at the Allied conferences. Harry Truman's biographer, David McCullough, writes the following about the Potsdam Conference, the last conference of the war held in the summer of 1945. The conference not only discussed the post-war order, but also confirmed the Soviet entry into the war against Japan in August. Quote, Stalin broke in even before his interpreter had finished with the president's statement. Quote, "Niet," end quote, said Stalin. Then, with emphasis and in English for the first time, he repeated, quote, "No, I say no," end quote. It was embarrassing, difficult. It was an embarrassing, difficult moment. Truman turned red, end quote. Roosevelt's son, Elliot, also made claims that Stalin understood English well enough to use it to his advantage at the Allied conferences. Allegedly, Stalin, quote, reacted to questions, end quote, even, quote, before they were translated into Russian, end quote. Quote, yes, I speak a little English. Understand more, end quote. Stalin is reported to have said with a thick accent. This statement matches McCullough's narrative about the Soviet leader's comprehension level. However, the extent to which Stalin could have actually used his listening comprehension to his advantage really remains undetermined, and I would say somewhat unlikely. Stalin was also quite charismatic. In fact, the Anglo-American leadership repeatedly stated that they enjoyed his company. For example, at the end of the Potsdam Conference, Truman wrote to his wife Bess, quote, "I like Stalin, he's straightforward," end quote. Biographer McCullough writes, quote, "Truman, as he wrote, found Stalin to be polite, good-natured, businesslike, quote, honest, but smart as hell," end quote. American statesman Jimmy Burns, who was present at the Yalta Conference, shared this sentiment. Quote, "The truth is," end quote, Burns remembered, quote, "he is a very likable person," end quote. Now, engaging in an amateur psychological assessment of Stalin is beyond the scope of this investigation. Others have done this, but I think there's some obvious limits to engaging in such pursuits. But we could say it's clear that Stalin's engaging personality helped build rapport with his British and American counterparts at the Allied War conferences, and possibly helped in the negotiations. As for English, it seems pretty clear that he did not speak it at the level of actually being able to engage in a serious conversation regarding operational questions of the war, and he needed an interpreter. He needed Pavlov's help. However, being able to understand some of Roosevelt's and Churchill's statements before they're translated may have added to his ability to read the intentions of the Anglo-American counterparts along with their body language a little bit better. Be that as it may, it's also obviously incorrect to say that Stalin did not know foreign languages, because Russian was not his first language, and he read Karl Marx, Friedrich Engels, several classic German philosophers in their Russian translations. There's still books in museums with his pencil side notes in the margins. And of course, there are also other languages from the Caucasus that he seems to have known conversationally so well enough to get around. So I think it's fair to say that he was a bit of a polyglot. So that's all I have for you guys. What do you think? Do you think knowing a foreign language fluently could really change the negotiations, as Keynes claimed in the case of the Paris Peace Conference and Italy? What foreign languages do you speak fluently? Some of you may know that I've been really focusing on my Japanese in the past year, but sometimes I wonder if I would ever get to the point where I could speak it with a reasonable accent and somewhat fluently. Thank you guys, and I will see you next time.